Hello. I perform under the moniker Current, and we're going to talk about playing with hardware, as you just saw. The talk is going to be in two parts, but we'll go straight through. The first one is more about the creative aspects of playing, performing live, and the second part is like more technical, about just all the technical things that you need to solve to do this. And then we're going to do QA. I can also talk about performing with the software Bitwig. I'm a Bitwig certified trainer. But let's see how it goes. If you want to interrupt me while I'm talking, that also works. Like, you know, if you have like a burning question, you can raise your hand, and you know, we'll accommodate it. So yeah, and then in the end, if there's not so many questions, I can keep talking about some of these aspects, because we're going to go pretty through a lot of stuff very quickly. So like, we can also cover anything in more depth if you like. So performing live. There's a ton of things one needs to solve, both creatively and technically, to do this, and it's a bit stressful. But I think that if you work up to it gradually, then some of the stress goes out, and you just got to keep at it. I've met people who performed live like once or twice, and they gave up because it was just too much like anxiety or something. But hopefully you go past that. So playing live is, that word is just like an umbrella term for a whole lot of ways of doing things. And I like to think of it as a spectrum. And the spectrum is basically how much of it you have planned versus how much you're going to improvise or sort of do things on the spot. So on the left side, we have the most extreme example is you have everything prearranged as audio, like in the, let's say in the Ableton Arranger view, or maybe you have everything sequenced here in song mode, and you just press play and it goes for like an hour, and then you drink a beer. Like, and I've seen some really big acts actually do that. They've been performing for a long time, so maybe they don't care anymore to like do things. But literally like beer in hand, giant stage, like, you know, just kind of checking the EQ a little bit. And then on the other end of the spectrum is like full improvisation, which means no presets for the sounds themselves, no samples, so you didn't record any of those sounds, so they sound how you expect them to sound. No patterns, meaning like no pre-programmed sequences, and maybe no plan. So that's like the other end of the spectrum. And I think I've spoken to quite a few people who play live. I think most people tend to plan a lot, and that's for two reasons. One is they're probably not comfortable, like, you know, improvising on stage, because more things could go wrong if you improvise. Not that things couldn't go wrong if you're not improvising, but like if you're improvising, it's more. And of course, there's some people who feel completely comfortable doing that. Now, what do we mean by improvisation? So most people, when they improvise, they're basically doing things that they did before and recombining them in sort of new ways. Even like jazz musicians, like they know, let's say they're going to play the scale, but they're not going to play it exactly how it should be played, or they're going to play one note off, and they know that that kind of works, so they'll like jam on that, and then like they'll switch to something that they kind of know it works. Of course, there's this sort of in the moment thing of like you make decisions based on, you know, the feedback, but even within that, like there's kind of like known territory and unknown territory, and I think most people try to go back and forth between like the known and the unknown to be more consistent throughout the whole time. Now, for people who not just play live, but, you know, produce, there's kind of like three different ways you could think about what a live performance is. One is like you could jam with your gear or in your studio and then record and then quote unquote finish that and turn it into a track, like a finished track. So you arrange it, you know, with even more fine details, you mix it, you master it, and then basically what you are doing is like playing turn into something that you're gonna put out as a quote unquote product or an artwork that you feel comfortable sharing in that form. The other approach, which I think is very, very common, maybe more common, I mean, I don't have some data to back this up, but I think people do this a lot. They'll produce songs on their computers or however they produce, and then they'll like break them into a jam. So they basically like finish something, and then they're gonna like cut it into pieces to be able to perform it. And I think the reason why a lot of people do that is partially because like they learn how to produce on, let's say, an Ableton or like with some gear, and then they're just comfortable with that, whereas like starting with the gear and then turning into a song is not their thing. And then the third way is like, you don't actually have to perform live the stuff that you produced, right? Like you could just, I don't know, like use the same gear or like a slightly different gear, but like your performance doesn't have to match what you produced before. I find that a little bit strange, but I know some huge names that do that, so you know, I guess that's like the third approach. I originally was going to say there's only two approaches, but the third one is don't mix the two. So I think one of the main things about like playing live, that's kind of like deciding where you are on the spectrum of planning versus improvisation, is whether you, I call them sections, which is basically your like tracks. If they are pre-programmed exactly how many times something's going to repeat before it moves to the next one or not. And I don't do that, partially because it's like weirder for me if it's moving on its own and I have to catch up. You could potentially do that for part of the time where you're like, okay, I am going to perform some material exactly as I hear it at home in terms of sequencing, and then I'm going to turn that off and then like jam and do stuff and then come back to that. I think that's a common approach, and it's also just conceptually, it's common to back to this sort of like comfort zone versus like what you're going to do on the spot. I personally don't use song mode, but it kind of depends on like if first of all, if you want to fix order, because maybe you don't play the tunes in the order that you want, like that you are used to. Maybe you kind of like DJing, like you could basically switch on the spot. Also, you could have way more material prepared than you have time to play, and at that point you could decide, you know, which tunes you're going to play and kind of determine the order and the duration on the spot. The other part is like, you know, if you're going to quote unquote like jam or like improvise, I just think it's harder if the thing is going to move without you, because like you kind of get in the zone and then something happens, you're like not prepared for it. So that's another thing that depends. And again, like I said, you can also just do it part of the time, like you don't have to do it the whole time. So let's say that like playing the set, and this is like fully improvised, but even if it's fully improvised, like you want to vary what's going on. And I tend to think of this as like sections and then what happens within the section. So the section is sort of like the track or the tune. And then within that is like how much you're gonna vary or express or like improvise. I think the length of the section varies greatly on the context, because if you're playing, I mean, in this case, it's kind of a mix, because like I'm playing dance music, but you guys are sitting down. So like it's like a weird, like it's like a dance concert or something. So I think generally it depends on a lot if your audience is sitting, because if they're like sitting down, it's like more like a concert, and then you could do something very long, or you could get into something really deeply and not change for like a long time. But if they're dancing, there's some expectation that something will change, and we'll talk a little bit about what could change and what different approaches to that. It also depends on your material. Like, I mean, if you, let's say you have tracks that like you made a track that's like 6 minutes and you sort of arrange everything in the most meticulous way, and you're just like, that's it. like that track should sound like this. I'm not gonna cut it. Then you play it for however long the track is, if you don't want to jam with it. It depends on how high your audience is, like how much they can perceive. So I have a couple of friends that have played hundreds and hundreds of gigs, like all over the world. And one of them recently told me, you can't just like, if you're gonna like play dance music, like you can't change too much. This is in the context of techno, by the way. So probably like if you're playing more like, I don't know, like breakbeat or bass music, or like music that basically has less of a steady rhythm, it's like more percussive and maybe syncopated, then maybe it's a different story, because your audience basically can take on more change. But if you're like in the kind of like floor to the floor context, then you probably don't want to change too much, because people just can't like comprehend, or they're not interested in like you kind of sending them on a journey. I think nowadays with like this like fast BPM stuff and like hard music, it's in TikTok basically, people are, just have shorter attention span. The same person who told me don't change too much, and some other people have told me like try to do things for like 6 to 8 minutes, and basically just really get into that experience and try to kind of do as much as you can within that, and then move on to the next thing, as opposed to like playing, let's say, 2, 3.5 minute things. You play one thing that's like 7 minutes, and you just kind of develop it further. And that also like makes sense with the machines, because like if you're, especially if you are not working so much with audio, and I'll mention why that matters, you have more potential to do sound design stuff. So I'll give you an example, like, I'm gonna play it, just give me a second. Where was that? Now I need to find it. Sorry, there's something resonating here, so I'm not gonna play that channel. Let me find another example. Actually, let's keep going, and I'll come back to that. Basically, you can do a lot more sound design stuff if you are working directly with the hardware, because you can basically pre-program knobs to do complex things with just like one twist of the knob, and then you could kind of perform with that section for longer. Okay, cool. So what are we doing within each section? So basically, like, what you're doing is composing, or like thinking of the composition, or like what changes over time. And at least in the context of dancing, you want to kind of bring the audience with you. So for that reason, you can't change too much, because the audience is just going to be like, what's going on? And there's actually, this has been studied by scientists. I went to a talk by a really smart guy from New Orleans, whose name I forgot, at TTM Festival in Berlin. And he studied exactly that, like what is happening in your brain when you're dancing. And essentially, our brains have this thing of like, can I predict what's gonna happen next? And music plays with that. Like if you have a certain like beat, and then like every, I don't know, 30-second step, there's like a clap, and then you're like, oh, the clap is here. And then if you repeat it enough times, the person's like, okay, the clap is here. And then you add something else, and they're like, oh, like that thing is also gonna come on the 30-second bar, or the 30-second step, or the 16th step. Like you're basically getting excited that you can predict what's going on. If you don't vary enough, people don't get excited, and if you vary too much, they can't guess. So then it's just not exciting for them. So this is what dancing is based on. Basically, like our brains are mimicking this movement and trying to predict what's going to happen next, and sort of rhythmically trying to stay with the rhythm and predict the next thing. And that thing is called vestibular self-stimulation, which is dancing. So within a section, like, what is there to do? So what I was doing here is, like, I have a bunch of patterns that are, I'll play an example. And I'm not playing the whole thing, but just so you get a sense. The variation, which is kind of like telling you something's about to happen. And there's this sort of like breakdown of like, okay, something else happened, like we removed. Like here, the kick is not present, so it's just. So there was this kind of cue of like, we have variation, and then it's like time for the next thing to come in, and then the next thing is the same beat with a little bit more variation. And so that's one way to do it, but it kind of assumes that you would have all these things planned ahead of time. Now, let's see. Another approach is to start muting and unmuting stuff or soloing. So now there's no kick. So now there's kind of like less stimulating you, and I could just bring just the kick back. Yeah, so you have the muting and soloing. Soloing would be just to have one thing in, let's say the kick. So like this. Now it's just solo, just one element. The kick's probably not the best thing to leave running on its own, but you can, especially if it's like a four to the floor thing. Like sometimes you want to give the audience a breather, and that's like just the kick, you know, maybe a snare or something. So those are two ways. The other one is to have the macros. Let me just find something that had a macro and make sure that it's you can hear what's going on. Okay, cool. Okay, that's the one I was looking for. So I have this sound, and I've prepared a couple of macros, which are pretty subtle, but you can kind of tell the difference. So. so that was macros. Basically, in some machines, you can pre-program a knob to do a bunch of things. When you twist the knob, it sort of like morphs the sound into something that just kind of changes a lot. And you could also have just like hardware that where the knob, its function doesn't change, and you just like know it's there, and you know what you're gonna get. So I'm gonna give you an example of that as well. Okay, so this is the sound that we started with, and one of the things I'm doing is I'm sending this to my effects chain, which is an 8-bit crusher, analog, and an analog delay, and the crusher is before the delay. So it makes this sort of sweeping sound. So in this case, like I know that this is my send for this sound because I have a separate channel for this, and I'll talk about that in a second. And I know that this knob is going to basically trigger the effect. I know on the effect there's another filter just within the effects, within the 8-bit distortion. And I know that when I twist the filter and I have this chain, it's going to kind of make the sound more crisp or more dense. And I've basically, I could do that anytime during the performance. It doesn't matter which section I'm in. If there's a sample on this specific pad, I could do that. So that's like for fixed knobs. And some people just prefer hardware that is only fixed knobs. Like there's no macros, and they love that because it's like, you know where everything is and you feel super comfortable. And that's particularly true, I think, for bass lines. Like some people, well, a lot of people use a 303, which is just like your classic Roland bassline machine. And then you also, some people will do that with the drum machine, like an 808, which doesn't have macros the way that the analog rhythm does. I personally love macros, but there's different people who do different things. The other part is like what I was doing with the filter here. So this is particularly true in dance music, but basically you have, if you look at a mix, a lot of times the kick is the sound that takes the most out of your sonic spectrum. So it brings the most density into the experience. And so a very easy way to reduce what's going on is to apply a filter on the kick, which is reducing some of the bottom end. I'm going to try to show you that real quick. So that's kick without filter, exciting. And now we have kick with a filter. And you kind of want to get used to like the filter that you're working with, so you can kind of do things on the spot. I use a different mixer at home, but it's also by, I use the Model 1, but it's the same company that makes it. So I'm used to this filter. Mine is the knob has, it's not as steep, the curve. So like you here, with less twisting, you get rid of more of the low end. But once you're like comfortable with how this works, like I think playing with the kick is one really easy thing. Another thing is like you could try to apply filters to like multiple sounds, which I was doing that in the end. So I'll give you an example. So here I'm removing the top end. So if I go here, sorry, here, it's like we kept the bass line, but we got rid of a lot of the other stuff. I could do the opposite, which is I'm just using the other filter, and in this mixer, you have two separate filters that are low pass and, well, you could set them to be low pass or high pass, and each channel can only be on one filter, so you can't do both at the same time. On the mixer that I used, you could do both at the same time, so you could kind of remove both from the top and from the bottom, and then kind of like navigate to like where you want to be. But basically, I mean, the filter works the same way in every mixer. It's just like you know, how you want to use it as an instrument and how many you have per for your setup. And also, these machines, except for the delay, they have filters on every track in addition to this filter. So I could like filter just like a part of a sound directly on the machine, and then the rest of the sounds would stay intact here. I don't get into that kind of detail unless the sound's really off, and like, let's say the hi-hat's just like going to the roof, and I lower just the volume of the hi-hat, or I filter out some of the hi-hat. And then the last part is like effects. We spoke about this a little bit. I mean, it's not the last way to do this, but the last one I'm going to talk about is your effects chain. So I already showed this setup. I'll talk a little bit later about different effects variations. This is just a meme about don't change too much because the audience is probably not going to like it. Always, for techno in particular, getting rid of the kick completely or like reducing it and bringing it back tends to work. And you're going to hear that a lot in like DJing. Basically, I don't know, if you go to like Berkheim or something, like it's like half the time the DJ is just like, well, that's not a data-driven number, like, but a lot of the time they're like removing the kick and then I kind of bring it back. So that brings me to the topic of like, how do you manage this whole thing in your performance and in your head? And I tend to think of sounds in these groups. There's like many ways you could think of them, but like for me, it's helpful to think of them in this way because they, I try to map them to different channels on the mixer, and then I kind of like always know what's going on and what's where. So like if I need to EQ something or do something on the spot, I know where that sound sits in my performance. This is one way of doing it. You could do it in any way. You don't even have to use a mixer. Like you could just kind of like chain all the gear together, and then you would mute and unmute and do things directly in the gear without the mixer. I like using a mixer because like you could do a lot with like one move. Like for example, if you apply the filter that's reducing the bottom end to like a bunch of channels, and you have just like one knob that's essentially like applying the same thing to every single instrument. And I like that. I think it's like a cool way to do stuff. But you don't have to use a mixer. So in my case, I have the kick in the first channel, which is a very common thing. I don't know, it's like probably most people that I speak with, if they're using a mixer, they put the kick on the first channel, which allows them to do this thing of like kind of turning it on and off just with the fader. And also you have a separate EQ for it, or a separate gain control like here. So yeah, sorry, that we flipped the to this camera. So basically like you could just with one kind of move like take it in and out if you don't have a mute that you use on the machine. I mean, I tend to do this, but I could have easily just muted it. So in this machine, I have individual outs, which means that I could kind of route the kick straight to a channel, and then it doesn't come in the rest of the channels, which is helpful because, you know, then I could sort of kill it with one move. Another thing that also does is the kick is not going to the effects, which for like low frequencies is often a good thing because you don't want to like kind of muddy up what's going on there. So it ensures that's the case. Again, there's different volume. The one thing that's like maybe like a downside, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the technical part, is that if you have some kind of compression or another master insert happening on your percussion, when you take the kick out of it, now that doesn't apply to it. So in the example of a compressor, if you use the compressor to sort of limit the loudness of your sounds, and the kick is not in the compression because it's not here, because your compressor is tied to the drum machine, then you're going to have to deal with that separately. I said we're going to talk more about it because I'll cover in the end, like having something on the very master, like sort of applied to all of the channels. There's many mixers that support that, so you could basically have a master insert directly in the mixer and adjust your compression either beforehand or while you play, and then the kick would be counted in that. The mixer that I use at home doesn't have that, and I could potentially just put it at the end, but I'm not doing that right now, so that's just one downside of having the kick separate. A lot of people talk about having phasing issues in their bass lines with the kick or on their own because of like how the speakers are. So I think it's common for people to have the bass lines also on a separate channel. I'm not doing that. Maybe if it became an issue, I will, but for the moment, I'm not. And so that means that like basically channel 1's kick, channel 2 is the rest of the other percussions, which sometimes includes field recording sounds or percussions that I kind of cooked on my own. They're not synthesized. They're prepared ahead of time and then layered. And then channel 3 is where all the melodic stuff happens. And in my case, that's both the low end melody stuff and the high, mid and high tones. Again, like some people would probably break those out, but I'm not doing that. And then we have pads and textures. I personally really enjoy having a lot of layers, but then I need to control them because like, let's say I'm in this like layered space and the layers are just it's getting too busy because I don't know, the room's reverberating or something, and then the mix is just too busy. If I try to keep them to one channel, then I can easily just EQ that channel or like do something to it. And I also do the same thing for the return. Basically, I think of the return as also something that can and should be mixed. On my mixer, I could apply the filter also to the return. On this one, you can't. I basically think of the textures and the pads as something similar to the return because like it's just a lot going on in one channel or a lot going on over a long period of time. And if I have a way to EQ or filter that channel, then it helps me kind of like manage what's going on, particularly if something's going wrong. So yeah, that's like my setup here. Can we switch to the mixer? Yeah. So basically kick, the rest of the analog rhythm, which is the rest of my percussion. This is the analog 4, where I do all the bass lines and some other more complex sounds. And we can talk more about that later. And then here I have the pads and the textures, which is that send that I spoke about earlier, that I know kind of how to add this flowy, windy thing anytime as a single knob. And then in this case, the return is here. At home, I use a mixer with more channels, so the return is like just another channel where I could apply a filter, but it's the same difference basically. So yeah, I think that's helpful organization. Now, the macros versus one knob per function, we covered that. The last thing I'll say is that about that particular topic is that knowing, even if you're more a fan of macros, having muscle memory for where things are in your machine in case like the sound's just getting weird is very helpful. So I prefer to use more macros and less of these individual knobs, but knowing where, like, let's say the filter is on these machines is very helpful. And in most machines you can go directly to them, but here, because everything is tied to a given track, see this thing here is the filter. So I know very quickly, let's say this is my sample and I want to give it some reduce some of the top with the filter, it's muscle memory for me to just do this and kind of move it. So it's helpful to know where your knobs are, even if you rely on macros, because there will be times where you have to adjust them. And I've heard from friends that basically sometimes you need to do that because the room will change the shape of your sound, and you're basically kind of redoing the sound design partially to work with the room. Yeah, so then we have effects. Delay and reverb are probably the most common effects that people use in performance. And the other most common thing that people do is use the event-tied effects because they sound great. I'm currently not using the event-tied ones. I've played with it with the H9 Max. And I probably will get into that eventually, but for now I'm sticking with delay and 8-bit distortion. For me personally, the delay is the most versatile effect because depending on what sound you're running through it and how much you twist it, and this is an analog, can we switch to the, yeah. So this thing here is the auto BIM, which is an analog delay stereo, and the preset that I have on it, which is blinking here, is tape delay, which adds these additional kind of textures. It has this, I don't know how to describe it, but like it adds something to it that's not just your standard delay. And I think that depending on how you use that and how you EQ it and how much you add, and if you do a feedback loop, which is sending a delay back to itself, you could do so much with it. So I think it's like the most versatile single effect. And of course the Eventide has all these creative effects, including delays and crushers, but they're digital. So this is one thing per box because it's analog, and in that one you have all these things in the same box. Yeah, also you could just use your laptop as an effects unit, like you don't, there's nothing wrong with that. So, okay, now soon we're going to transition to the more technical stuff, even more technical than this. But I want to kind of suggest a couple of things to just do. Well, first of all, like a big picture thing is like, I personally believe that if you're working on music, you should try to do it as often as you possibly can. Like, meaning like if you have a job or something, like try to do it every day after your job or before your job or whatever. And I'm not currently at least, not a believer in this, like, I'll do it when the inspiration comes, because if I waited for that, it might not happen. So that's kind of big picture. Like, more specifically, what I try to do, and talk about that for the Analog 4 in particular, is like, I try to do some sound design exercises, like, along with like jamming and working on compositions. So one of them is like, I'll take a complex patch that I really like one of the presets on the hardware, or I'll go into like Faceplant or Bitwig and just look at something really crazy that does a million things, and I'll try to remove or break part of it until the part that I really like is gone. So I'll try to figure out what is it that I really like about this patch, and then figure out which part of it does that. And when I have a more kind of refined understanding, I'll try to recreate a similar sound, maybe not the exact same one, but like do something similar complex that I like, and see if that works, and sometimes it does. And then the other one is like, you could just go through the pain, and this is harder when you're beginning and probably gets easier over time, but not terribly easy, is to try to do things from scratch. Like, always start with like nothing, like some oscillators and some other things that you could add, and try to make sounds from scratch, which is kind of painful because like you find out quickly that a lot of things you really like are really hard to make on your own from nothing or no idea, but that's okay. Like, I think it's worth the pain, even if it's you know, frustrating in the beginning, or for a long time. Other ongoing things to do. Always like listen to your jams. Like, basically, let's say you're working on something and then you're like, okay, but I'm too close to the screen here. Like, I'm just like, I'm in it and it sounds amazing, but maybe like 3 days later, you're like, this is like the worst thing I've ever made. So you want to basically like record yourself performing these things or like playing them for yourself, just like what I did here, but I do that at home. I'll like record the same performance, and I'll try to time it in the same way. So like, because it's very easy when you're at home and there's no audience to just get stuck on something and you're like, you know, playing with the filter for 8 minutes. And if you don't record yourself, you might not notice that you're doing that. And so I think it's a great idea to always record and listen as if it's not your music. You're kind of trying to judge it more objectively if that's possible. And ideally, you also listen to it not just the same day, like you wait for like 5 days. And I've read in a lot of interviews with some of my favorite producers that basically they'll even let the track sit for like 3 months or something, and then listen to it, and that's the final test. You know, like if it still sounds exciting 3 months later, then maybe it should be released. So yeah, always like try to basically capture what the audience is going to hear, and then listen to it later, ideally much later, or just not at the same day. Cool. So that was like the creative part, or more creative part. Now we're going to talk some more, even more techie things. So audio versus synthesis. Oh, I had a slide for this. Okay. Sorry, the slides are a little bit out of order, but whatever. Okay. So audio versus synthesis. So I personally really, really enjoy sounds that are not printed to audio. And the reason why I enjoy that is because if you put a lot of modulations in especially when you're playing at home, like they sound basically, if you put enough modulation, it never repeats in exactly the same way. It's basically like kind of alive, like, and there's this sort of the Zen metaphor with the river, you never step into a river twice. Well, that's the same for like really complex patches. Like you never quite loop. Like there are different subsections that are looping, but the end result is never exactly developing in exactly the same way. I really enjoy that, which is why I'm playing with hardware where each machine could do that. And the Electron machines are particularly good at that because you have all these ways to play with the sound, and they have parameter logs, which I'm guessing most of you know what that is, but for those who don't, you could basically change all the parameters individually on each step. So like you could basically change the pitch per step, you could change the filters, everything. And I find that to be sort of like, you know, provides like infinite opportunity to for the thing to like evolve over time. And also you have probabilities, and both in hardware and software. So you could essentially say, okay, something will play 30% of the time. And when you add different modulations to different parameters, then it becomes really alive. So I love sounds like that, but if I was to only play like this, I would have to bring like way more gear, and I'm personally not a fan of collecting gear. I know a lot of people collect a lot of gear and they spend like time and money on each piece. I try to reduce things, but like if I was really into like always hearing the sound like perfectly as is, then I would have like this giant like rig of stuff around me, which is, if you've seen what the Chemical Brothers perform with, like there's an article out there which I recommend reading. It's from their sound engineer, and they basically, like in the beginning of them performing live, they had a much simpler setup, and over time they just bring more and more of the studio. And if you open that article, I should have actually added as a slide, but like just look it up. They're basically surrounded by gear, like they're 360, like it's their whole, I mean, it looks like somebody's whole studio is on stage, and they're literally, you can't even see them because there's like gear up to here, you know, and so they're just like bring out everything, and it's up to the sound engineer to figure out how they're going to deal with that mess and bring it, and they have to basically like do sound check for, I don't know, like 6 hours or something, and again, it's mostly on the guy to figure it out. So sometimes you have to print to audio. today I wanted to fit everything in my carry-on, which is basically this backpack here. Show it. It's one backpack. And a small bag. So that means that some things are going to have to go in audio. So I basically printed some of my wavetable sounds to this pad here, which I know is coming out on this channel, and then I can both get my complex sounds and I get to play with them a little bit in live. But at home, I'm sort of constantly like modulating them and doing that. Another thing is like sound quality. That's like an endlessly debatable topic that I don't think we should get into right now. But some people prefer how the actual machines sound. And the benefits of like audio are that if you're performing with a laptop, then it doesn't use as much CPU. So one thing that, oh, actually, let's talk about laptop versus no laptop. Did I have a slide for that? I do. So I basically don't think it matters if you're playing with a laptop or not. It's just whatever makes you happy. I think the one difficult thing about laptop is that it could introduce this single point of failure. So like if you're using the laptop as like the brain of your setup and then starts to like overheat or crash or whatever, like then like the sound is gone. And that's a problem, right? So like if you're gonna use a laptop, maybe one thing to try to do is like be prepared if the laptop starts to perform in a really weird way. What are you gonna do, right? So if you have like at least one other piece of gear, you could even like restart the laptop. Like you just like let the other gear do its thing, like let's say a drum machine, and then like your laptop melts and crashes. You have, you know, ideally it restarts in less than a minute or something, and you could pick up from where you were. So basically that means it's not a single point of failure. Also, you could use a laptop not as like the brain of your operation. Like some people perform only with a laptop and a MIDI controller, or laptop and a beer in hand. It depends on like how fancy you want to get. So yeah, you could either use laptop and just nothing else. You could use laptop and a lot of other stuff, or you could have the laptop just perform some specific function that you decided. So one is like you could use it to sync, and quickly I'm going to jump into syncing. So there's like 3 ways to sync your stuff. Audio, MIDI, and Ableton Link. I haven't tried audio myself, but there's some hardware devices that will send an audio pulse, and that's actually what that giant setup from the Chemical Brothers is based on in terms of sync. They have some device, or maybe it was like audio from their laptop, but it's basically, there's a pulse of audio that's going to every machine, and that is the most reliable way possible because it doesn't like drift or do weird things. It's always the same. For some reason, MIDI can drift or like kind of get weird, and then if it does, you got to figure out if you're gonna roll with that or you're gonna have to try to restart something to sync it back in. I've personally had good times or good fortune with Ableton Link as a sync. Sometimes I'll use a laptop, and then instead of using MIDI, which is what I'm doing here, like here the master clock is analog 4 and goes separately to each one of these boxes, except for the mixer. Even though this mixer also supports MIDI, but I'm not doing, it's not helpful to me. So I'm basically, this is the master, it goes out to these other boxes. Some people are paranoid that their master clock's gonna dissolve. So they will have a separate device that's just clock. And what that means is like if in my case, if the analog rhythm like just goes to shit, like I could restart the analog rhythm and the clock still keeps going. In my setup here, this is the only single point of failure because of the clock, but it's not even like totally a single point of failure because I could just go out of sync for a little bit. Like basically, this set was at 140 BPM, so I could just restart this machine and then keep the clock here on 140. These things will be out of sync, but it's okay because they're effects boxes, so you probably wouldn't tell the difference, or I would just not use them for a moment. And then I could restart it and come back. So I highly recommend to think about that, meaning what happens if each individual thing that's in your I have a slide about this topic, but basically like the third point here is single points of failure. So always make sure that that there isn't a single point of failure, and if each thing fails you have a plan and you rehearse that plan for how you're going to deal with that. And actually, every machine except for this delay, I'm not trying to like show you this delay, but like every machine that I've used goes out of whack. Particularly the analog ones, but also it happens with a laptop. So with a laptop, a plugin could crash your laptop, or the CPU just goes crazy, and now you're like screwed because like you have to figure out what you're going to do about that on stage. On analog machines, the oscillators, they actually like. So another reason why they sound more alive is that the oscillators like warm up, and so it's not the same thing all the time, and depending on how old the machine is, like they could sound very different from session to session. I haven't had that happen with these, but things that I have had happen is like, for example, on analog 4, it's a 4-voice machine, but sometimes the voices are shared. So basically, it's playing a certain sound and then switching to another sound with the same voice. And in that transition, like basically the first sound could affect the second one, and sometimes the second one gets stuck on this like weird version of that's affected by the first one, and now the sound's not the same, and it just keeps going, not the same, not the same. You're like, okay, like, am I gonna roll with that, or am I gonna like reset that sound or stop that sound and come back so I could have my thing? Same thing has happened to me with the drum machine. Like sometimes, unfortunately, this specific unit, I don't know if it happens to all of them, like it will just introduce a sound that's like, it's not in any of the pads. Like I could mute all the pads and the sound is still there. And that like sucks because like that's the worst thing for like a piece of hardware. I just am prepared for that, and if that happens, I'll basically make sure I'm only running on the other channels. So these two are the drum machines, so I'll like put them down, and then I'll literally restart it with the power button. And then to resync it, I'll just like quickly stop the audio for a second and restart it. So I'll wait for like to be at the end of a sequence, and then just kind of boom, put it back on with the machine, restart it, and I have a plan. And I suggest you have a plan for every piece of gear that's going to happen. And for a laptop, we can talk about Bitwig, or we could do QA. We'll get there in a second. But for in Bitwig in particular, there's plugin sandboxing, which means that you could put each plugin in its own container, and if that plugin crashes, you can just restart that plugin alone, and then like it doesn't take down your whole session. And you could also group them, so you sandbox a few things, and then that takes less of your CPU. And then you could, if one of these crashes, you would have to restart all of them, but the rest would keep going. So you can kind of like decide how much of your resources are going to dedicate to that. So yeah, that's just a lot on like try not to have a single point of failure. And if you're going to use a laptop, try not to have that be the single point of failure. You could use it for sync. You could use it as a sampler. Like this sampler is simpler. Sorry, not trying to make jokes here with Ableton. But this, the sampler here is only mono, and you cannot shape the sound a lot with it. So basically, I prepared the sounds that I'm using here meticulously on the laptop, and then I put them here. There are samplers that are more complex, like just using your laptop as a sampler, or having a standalone machine like the Octatrack or the Digitact. But yeah, instead of having those machines, you could just use your laptop simply as a sampler. Or you could use it simply for effects, so you don't have these things. You just send one of the auxiliary sends to the laptop, and then you do crazy things there. And you could also use it to put it on the master. So that thing that I was talking about with compression on the master, like I have friends that do that on the laptop, and they also use this as an effects unit. I have other friends that would never do that because they're afraid that the laptop's going to crash. So if you're using it as a master compressor, then and it crashes, game over for a few minutes. So yeah, this is just like, if you're going to use a laptop, some things to think about, namely how you're going to use it and how to avoid single points of failure. Okay, so we covered everything except for the master and the gain staging and what could go wrong. So gain staging is more of an engineering topic and a production topic, but basically you need to control the levels and the dynamics of your sound in each of these machines, or at each steps of the audio signal chain. And these machines themselves have, it's kind of like worth looking occasionally at the manual and the circuit diagram to figure out how the audio is going through each thing. And for example, if the effects are a send, which means that they're going to another channel, or they're on the master. And basically, you want to make sure that you have enough level at each one of these steps, so you don't just like, you're not super quiet at one step, and then you're compensating for that in another. And the dynamics part is basically, if you have a sound, and this is like a bit easier to like see on a laptop where you have like the visualization of the amplitude is like very clear and ideally like a kind of a longer thing. You can see how much the sound varies within a hit. And if it's a lot, then that could be tricky, because basically you could have sounds that are like just hit and it's like all of a sudden super loud. And if there's nothing on the master to limit that, then you could just have like a part of your set just like explode with loudness, and then you have to figure out how you're going to bring it down, like come here and be like, which sound is it, like, or pull it with the fader or with the gain or level. So one way to avoid that is to do the gain staging ahead of time carefully and just kind of make sure that doesn't happen. You could also, if you're printing things to audio, you could basically put a limiter on that sound before you print it to audio, and that's going to reduce the dynamics ahead of time. So it's a little bit of prep work ahead of time, but you know that's not going to happen in the end. But you could also just put something on the master, and I've heard different people do that. Some people who play, again, there's friends whose names I'm not going to mention, who play, easily 500 gigs live. They don't actually put anything on the master, but one of them is like really into gain staging, and the other one just said basically, I don't think that the audience can hear the difference if I'm using a compressor or not on the master. I think that if you're not going to use something on the master, then you just have to be careful with the levels and the dynamics. And if you're going to use something on the master, there's a bunch of boxes that do that. Like there's one, I think it's the Autobaum, which is a saturation unit by Auto Machines, which has a compressor, so you could use it either to compress, or you could use it as a way to color your sound. And I'm not doing that here, but I generally am kind of really into like saturation and distortion. I love playing with coloring the sound. And one other exercise that I would like recommend is find some saturator either in software or in hardware, ideally one that has a lot of different kind of ways to control it, and basically run a sine wave through it with a simple gate. So basically imagine you're going to make a kick, and you take just like a low tone with a little bit of shape to it, like an envelope, and then you play with saturation controls to see what each thing does, and you're looking at it on a spectrogram, and you are seeing the additional harmonics and like basically what that's doing. And then you could do so much with just understanding how saturation is affecting the sound. So you could be doing that with your master if you're more adventurous, or you could just do that with individual sounds. But if you're gonna, put stuff on the master, generally it's compression or saturation, and then you could also have just like a peak limiter, which is sort of just capping your signal so it doesn't go over there like super loud. But most rigs are also going to have a limiter there, so like even if it does, like these guys will save me, I think, or hopefully. For each, if you're going to put something on the master, it's probably worth it to spend some time trying different settings and like playing with it, and see what works for you, and if you can even tell the difference, because maybe there's no difference, and then you just spend a lot of time learning, which is great. But like some of these boxes, like there's one made by Stimming called the Instant Mastering Chain, which costs like 2,000 or 3,000. It's like an analog, maybe like 2,500 analog box that's solely dedicated to EQ, compression, and a little bit of saturation on the master. So that's an expensive thing to just have for that. If you're playing a lot live, maybe it's worth it. But you could also do it with the auto, I think it's Baum, it's a red one, which is a cheaper box. So you could just do it on a laptop to see if you can tell the difference and it's worth it, and then maybe invest in it. So the last thing we'll cover on the technical side is like what could go wrong. A lot. Basically everything that's happening here could go wrong. When you have somebody help out, like a sound engineer like here, they're going to make sure that this part is solid, but it's on you to make sure that like everything else is solid. So that means like your level, like how these things interact, what happens if the sync gets out of whack, what happens if one of them crashes or starts to sound really weird and you need to restart it. So there's a whole lot, but I'll mention some of the main ones. So for monitoring, so when earlier when we were setting up, one of the speakers had like an extra like sound in it, and these guys had a second set of monitor speakers. So, and I actually like how these sound better. And so we were able to quickly swap that. Sometimes the monitors suck and there's nothing you could do about it. And then it's just like, when you're sound checking, it just sounds like totally different from what you're expecting. And sometimes the monitoring is different from the main sound system. And then you may want to actually play your sounds and go listen not in the booth, because that's what your audience is going to hear, and then kind of tweak things for that. That's like the ideal scenario, but a lot of times you actually don't have that luxury, because sometimes there's no sound check. Like sometimes you're just setting up while the other person is playing, like on a table behind them, and then like it is what it is. Like you go, it's on. And on festivals where there's a lot of live acts, they'll basically, you set up on a table, and in those cases you usually had a sound check before that, and when one act is done, they'll like just bring the whole table, and everything is like velcroed to the table, so like they can just literally like bring your whole setup and drop it on the stage, and off you go. And so that's like an ideal scenario, including the sound check, but there's also the scenario that you put everything on the table and there's no sound check, and you go on the stage and it sounds totally different, and then you have to live with that. And I've also heard from one of these friends who played hundreds and hundreds of gigs that like, if you play festivals and there's a lot of acts before you, like you may do the sound check, but like 8 hours later, like those speakers don't even sound the same anymore for whatever reason, like the membranes, or just like the physical qualities of the sound system are changing over time, or maybe somebody did something for the previous act and now your sound check is kind of useless. So yeah, that's happens. So I think that's probably the most difficult things are poor monitoring, at least for me, and no sound check. We spoke about single points of failure and restarting your gear. If you have questions about that, we can cover them later. Other things that I've experienced is like power supplies. So basically, electricity is different in different parts of the world. Like in the States, is 110. I don't know if it's volts or what. Sorry, I'm not an electricity person. Most power supplies nowadays actually support both. So these machines, the electron power supply, and it shows that here in the machine. It says it's between 100 and 240 volts, which means that the plug is different, but the power supply is the same. And that's great because you could just have the different plug and then you don't need an additional power supply. But not all of them are like that, especially older machines. This machine, the Auto Biscuit, which is the 8-bit crusher, this machine is not made anymore. It's one of those machines that get more expensive with time, so you can only buy it secondhand. And I heard that it's because they no longer make some of the components in the machine, so they can't even produce new ones even if they wanted to. And for this machine, I was playing in the States earlier this year, and I didn't realize that I guess I didn't read the power supply. It doesn't work with 100 volts, which is what they use in the States, or 110 or 120. And I was like so sad because I really wanted to hear this machine, and I figured out quickly, like on Amazon, that you could get this thing that basically switches the electricity from 110 to 240 volts. And I ordered it like overnight to some like, pickup location, and I was excited. And then we plugged it in, and it turned out that like it's so like flimsy and rickety that like we had to like tape the entire like this thing. Like we put the converter and then this power supply on top of it, and then like taped it with like tape. And then I was like, okay, I thought that's a great idea. And then I started to play. It somehow like this shaking a little bit would change the electricity for the whole table, and my laptop would crash. Like, and this is like so weird. And we tried to, luckily it was a live stream where we were not broadcasting it live. We broadcasted later. And like I start, and then the laptop just melts, and because the table vibrated a little bit. And luckily I was able to kind of stabilize it and still use it, but I was completely unprepared for like basically the power supply just not being the right voltage. So to mitigate that, you could just read your, they cover the range for wherever you're gonna go play, if it's different, and also make sure you have the right plugs, which means that you probably are not gonna have the right plug for every piece of gear. So you may wanna bring like one of these with you, and then just have one different plug for like the one outlet, but then you need to calculate how many of these you need. I'm using like, this is typically not, is on its own, so in this case I'm using 6. So I put in my, what I need, which is called a writer, like that I need 6 plugs, and here they are. And cables, I had that same gig in the States. This is the last thing we'll cover before QA. I brought my own, I flew with my own mixer because I really like that mixer, and it didn't work to rent it in Miami. Like the rental person just responded and then they stopped responding. So I flew with my own mixer, and that mixer has these breakout cables, which is like it's like 8 channels in one cable, and then they break out into individual like cables. And when I was using it at home, it worked, but when I went there, it would just like fall off. Like I would like plug it and then like start playing, and it would just like, and that's like 2 full channels because I was using it for 4 inputs and sometimes 6. And so like now I need like 3 more cables just to replace that cable. And luckily, I could just use instead these, the RCAs. So I went and bought like 3 more cables, and I probably have at home like 10 cables like that, but I didn't bring extra cables because then it would have been even more stuff to bring, and I had to deal with that. Today I forgot one of the cables because I brought cables that would have worked with my mixer, and this one is rented. Luckily, the guys had some extra cables, so I basically borrowed some cables. So yeah, those are some of the things that could go wrong. There's a lot more that could go wrong, but we don't have time for that. So this is the material that I prepared as in like slides and no, I was going to talk about this. From here, we can do one out of three things. One is like you can ask me questions if you have questions, and we can talk based on those questions. If you don't have questions or you have few questions, we could go in more on a specific topic, like when maybe we could vote somehow on which topic is of interest to you, whether technical performance. And then the last part is like I said, I'm a Bitwig certified trainer, and so pretty much everything that I can do with these machines and a lot more, I know how to do with software too. And I just, we ran a poll like on the module Instagram, and 9 out of 10 people voted that I should talk about hardware, but 1/10 voted about Bitwig, so I could always talk about Bitwig. I don't have like a slides, or I'm not prepared for it, but any topic you want about Bitwig, I could cover it. I could also just open the project and start talking. So we could take a break, but we probably don't want a break because then you would just leave. Or do you want to take a break? Do you want a break or not? Who wants a break? Nobody? Okay, one person? Okay, no break. Cool. Yeah, let's power through this. Okay, so let's decide. Do you want to do Q&A, cover a topic in detail, or talk about Bitwig? Who wants to do Q&A? 2 people? Okay. That means not that many questions. Who's interested in covering a topic in detail? Nobody. Great. That one's off. Is anyone interested in Bitwig? No Bitwig fans? 1. Okay, cool. So, I mean, easy. Then we could basically cover your questions, and then I'll talk a little bit about Bitwig, and, you know, it's off you go. And if you come up with more questions, then you can interrupt me, and we'll cover those as well. Yeah, so questions. Do they need a microphone so people online could hear it, or it doesn't matter? Doesn't matter. Okay, just I'll repeat the question.
How many times do you play your program before going to stage?
What do you mean? Like how much I practice?
Yes, you know your program, but you need to remember anything, all details, and before going to stage, when you maybe get nervous or some emotions, you need to be ready 100%.
Absolutely. So I'll repeat the question. It's basically how much do I practice a specific material or like set before I'm comfortable playing it on stage. I'm not going to quantify it in like time or sessions, but I will say until I wanted to put a quote and I forgot to put it. One of my favorite quotes is it's one line from a poem by T.S. Eliot, and it is, "You are the music while the music lasts." So you want to feel like you are the music, meaning you know it like the back of your hand. So you basically feel so comfortable with what's going on or any one section that like there's no like nothing that could throw you off too much, you know. And in my case, because I was manually advancing each part, that means that like I know, I don't remember what each next step is, but I have this way of, can we switch to the gear? I have this way of kind of hinting myself what's going to happen next. So if you look at these things here, you can see how they light up. This is when I'm changing the patterns. Some people call them kits because in these machines you could tie a kit to a pattern. But basically, when I'm skipping a step here, sorry, this is the pattern, it means that there's a bigger change coming. So if there's nothing here, which means like empty, then there's like a new section or like something more dramatic happening. And same thing here. This is on the drum machine, but it's the same idea. Like basically, this is the intro and then break and then some more drastic change. Also, pretty much a lot of the people, or I don't want to say all or most, but like a lot of people have these, like what I have here, which is like a notepad, which is like a very basic kind of map of the territory that I'm covering. And I tend to use it to remember some of the transitions, like, because with this material, I could actually mix the material in a way where I could take the percussion from one tune and play it with the sounds from another, and it won't sound perfect, but it kind of works. So I basically have some notes on like how much they can overlap. So basically, to answer your question, I would say until you're extremely comfortable with what you're doing, so much that you either know it by heart or are prepared to deal with something going wrong and you getting thrown off. There's also a quote by Surgeon that he says, when you're playing live, you're like, you should count on being 50% dumber, like meaning like you're just, because of the pressure and anxiety and stress and being on stage, like you kind of want to simplify everything and just expect that you're not going to remember everything. So simplify even further, try to do less, so if you do get thrown off, it's easier to come back. And then the other thing is like, you can always have these sort of safety zones where like, even if something goes really wrong, you have like kind of the escape hatch where it's like, okay, I know that two pattern, like one pattern here and one pattern here are going to sound really good. So I just try to get out of trouble, and then I come to these patterns, and now it's like I'm back, you know. I tend to be comfortable in front of people because I've done, my background is in fine art and performance art, like before I was doing sound. So I'm comfortable in front of people, but I completely understand that it's very, very difficult. But I would, that's another reason why I think that you should practice probably every day. Like, because I mean, sometimes I can't do it for like a week or two. And then when I come back, it feels like I'm starting from nothing, like I forgot everything. But then when you practice like 1 or 2 days, you're kind of back in it. So yeah, it's up to how much stress you could handle. But generally, until it feels like you are the music, have a kind of an escape plan and assume you're 50% dumber. What was the other question or questions?
Yeah, I have one question. So first of all, thanks for the presentation. That was really
Thank you.
But you talked about live performance, right? But when you decide to go to the production side and record your tracks, how you approach the arrangement? So you do everything inside of the machines, because electron is particularly good in that, and then just record to the laptop, or you just prepare some chunks on machines and then put all together inside of Bitwig, whatever.
Yeah, that's a great question.
More about like workflows.
Yeah, for sure. So I've played with just laptop, or produced with just laptop and played with just laptop, and everything is MIDI, so I'm just controlling the laptop. I've played only with hardware like I did today. I've done a mix of both. For me, and this is like a personal thing, it's difficult to actually make arrangements in the laptop. Like for me, it's easier to have these sequencers, and then I could get like a rough thing here, and then when I go to the laptop, the general logic and structure is already figured out, and I could like refine it, so I could decide how long something will be or add some extra layers or something. But I think most people are actually the opposite. Like they're more comfortable in the arranger view. They could get something perfect, and then they have to figure out how to bring it here. But I think arrangement is probably probably the most difficult topic, and each person, well, in my case, I do it quite differently in that like I prefer this, and basically for me to go into the like finish it mode or go into the laptop, it needs to be already really solid here. Like I can't, basically like I'm doing most of the work here, and then when I go there, it's like finish it. But you know, you could be the opposite way where you do everything in the laptop and then you come here and you're like, okay, how am I gonna jam with it? Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, and when you use laptop, typically you control like machines through the MIDI, so they're playing like external audio instrument, or you just drop audio to the DAW and then do the arrangement.
I'm a instrument maximalist, which means that I'll try to have as little audio as possible. Many people are afraid of that because of the CPU. They're afraid that if everything was an instrument, and the more instruments there are in software, they will crash the laptop and then it's game over. A lot of people will not have anything that's synthesis in the laptop. It's only audio, and that's the lowest CPU, and they're most comfortable with that. I use Bitwig, and Bitwig is with the Mac GPU, the Apple Silicon. It actually performs really well. So I could have a lot going on and still like the CPU is not going through the ceiling, but there's still a limit. Like I can't just like endlessly putting like modular synthesis patches in here. It's gonna, be too much for the laptop eventually. So I prefer to have everything alive. And the reason why I printed this to audio is because I didn't want to have a laptop and I wanted to only bring these two machines. So I have to figure out how to shove the audio into this, or shove the more complex sounds into this mono sampler, and which means that I spend a lot of time making them there, like pads and stuff, and then I put them here. It probably depends on your laptop. If your laptop is you're not so confident in its abilities, then you should print everything to audio, and then you don't get this fun. But I'm not so afraid of that, and I guess if you also have gear, even if the laptop goes to shit, then you could restart it, so it kind of depends on what you're going to do. But if it's only laptop, then probably you should be on the safe side. You had a question?
Yeah, thank you for your amazing performance. I have a couple of questions already. When you have a track on your electron boxes and you want to record it to your computer so you can arrange it later or just mix it, do you use overbridge or just record the audio or maybe individual audio outputs from your electron boxes?
That's a great question. I actually think overbridge is great, and I'm kind of a fan of it. A lot of people are like, screw overbridge, just do everything in the box, particularly because they're afraid that if you're actually, this is not in the context that you asked, which is how to track it out, but if you're performing live and you're running overbridge at the same time, it's adding, it's taking some of your CPU power. So a lot of people are like, don't touch overbridge, you could just play here. I like overbridge because you can see everything in the UI if you want to get more into sound design. And also because it provides the individual outputs, like you pointed out. The thing is that these effects are sends on these machines, and on these two in particular. I don't remember on all the other ones. So that means that the individual outs are dry. That's kind of tricky because you end up with these individual things, which is great, but then they sound very different from the same thing with the effect. And then you have this one effect. You could just have the effects track and overbridge, but the problem with that is the modulations of the effects, if there's an LFO on the delay amount or something, and you capture the dry delay and the other delay, and you do that, and the master effects, and you do that with a bunch of sounds, they may not actually kind of line up because of the modulation and the effects is somehow, if you're modulating both the dry sound and the effect amount, you may have a hard time bringing them together, and that's not ideal. Another way, which is way slower, is to essentially, it's kind of the same as if you didn't have individual outs, and you would basically run the dry signal and with the effect send. You'd mute everything else. You'd solo this, you'd mute everything else, and record your wet version of that channel, and then repeat. I have to do that anyway because of the mixer that I use, because it doesn't have a sound card in it, and because I wanna. When using an analog mixer, if instead of applying the effect in the box, I was literally moving the filter with my hand, I can't record that as MIDI because my mixer doesn't have MIDI. This one does, but not every mixer has MIDI. So I would have to basically record audio anyway because of like what I'm doing with the effects here. And that's way slower, but then you get everything. The individual outs are actually still useful because you might want to layer the dry signal later in the DAW with the full signal to like kind of make it come out more, or like it's basically like EQing it by layering it. So there's things like that that's still useful for, but unfortunately for me I can't. I mean, if it's just the kick or just the bass line, you could probably do that because you're not using the effects on that. But for the other ones, unfortunately, if the effects is an important part of it, then you can't do it. You have to do it one at a time. But since Overbridge supports this, you could always just record a whole session in multi-track, and then if it's useful, and you do the rest manually if some channels it doesn't work for, and if it's not useful, then you have to do it manually. But I think Overbridge is great.
Okay, thank you. And another question, you have some projects set up in your electron boxes, and then you think that you are done with it, and you want to move to the next thing. How do you like?
I know where this is going.
Like, it's a blank project, or you just copy previous project, or some maybe like one of previous projects, and then start to tweak it.
I've thought about this problem a lot, and it's very unfortunate that these machines don't have. You could fork, which means you could copy a project and then do something different, and you could do that again where you start with the same starting point and branch off, but you cannot bring them back together, right? Like you have two different projects. I think it's super unfortunate that there's no copy and paste between projects. So you cannot copy and paste the pattern, you also cannot copy and paste the kit, so you have to recreate it, which sucks because like basically you branch off into, let's say I worked on a certain live set and then I started from scratch with another one, and now I'm like, oh, this is great, but I want to bring this one track from over here. Well, I can't do that because, I mean, I'd have to recreate it like sound by sound, and I've had to do that because at first I thought it would bring this other synth here before I printed it to audio. Like I had some stuff from the laptop printed to audio, but I also have this synth, and I thought I was going to bring the synth, but then I realized it's a bit of a hassle to also change the presets on that synth while I'm doing all this other stuff, and I didn't want to use program change for that. So I had to reshuffle some of the sounds here so that my long pads are always on this channel. And when I had to do that, in these machines, actually, if you save, I mean, this is not the case for Analog 4, but then here, if you save a sound that's using one circuit, you cannot move it to another easily because each circuit has different components in it. And I had to recreate some sounds from scratch, and also I had to resample, basically some of the sounds in here, I sampled them to audio and put them on another pad just so I could like rearrange the pads. Today I was playing with all of these, which they're 12 buttons, but they're actually 8 voices, and here there's 4 voices. So my palette for today was 12 things at a time. And with a laptop, you have infinite things at a time. But with these machines, you're limited. And I had to figure out how to fit everything in those 12 voices, which means that I printed some things to audio just so that I don't have to bring more machines. But I guess if I had a Digitac and I wanted to bring it, or if I wanted to use the laptop for audio, I could do that there. But yeah, unfortunately with these machines, there's no way to bring them back. And you might have to, if you branch off and you want to come back together, you would have to literally like recreate that track. So that's a pain in the rear. So I don't try not to find myself in that situation. So I basically have to answer your original question, like I have to choose up front. Like, is this going to be based on my previous stuff, or I'm going to start from scratch? And the gig in the States where I was had the power supply issues where I flew with the mixer, was, because it was only online, there's like no audience like in person, I could do more ambient stuff and more like beat stuff and then like force to the floor in one thing. And so that project is like very different. And I decided here to just start from scratch. But then I can't bring easily anything. So I would say probably, yeah, just try to decide up front. But if you're, I mean, it depends again on the context, because if you're like, this is going to be a dance set and like, you know, it's probably, you should start from the other project. You can always delete the patterns and stuff. But if it's completely different context, like one is ambient and the other one's dance, you could just save the sounds and resequence them again. So it really depends on if those, I guess if those projects will be the same context, yeah.
I have a question about the effects on analog for, yeah, first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was like extremely helpful because I'm using analog for stuff.
Thank you.
You don't use the analog for effects, right?
I do, but I don't use them, like, so one of the people who I mentioned who's playing a lot of gigs, he also happens to play with these two machines, and he also has an effects chain. But his effects chain is more complex than this one because he has one effects unit that can do a lot of things. And he has the, that effects chain, like hard chain to the analog 4. So he uses, like in his set, this is always dry, like the analog rhythm is always dry. And this is where you get to play with the effects. And so we're both using effects, like I'm using effects, he's using effects, but my effects are part of the sound design, where like a lot of these things have like a little bit of delay or a little bit of chorus or a little bit of reverb, and it's just part of how they sound when I filter them. But it's part of the sound design, and I think this machine, I think, is amazing because, first of all, it's multi-voice, so it's not just one synth, like one voice, one sound. And second, you have so many ways to shape the sound, but it's still analog sound, and you have quite a lot of modulation options. You have like multiple envelopes, like 2 here. You have the amp envelope. You have the 2 LFOs. And you could also use the parameter locks, and you could also use overbridge to send additional modulations coming from the dive, as if this was not enough. And I've thought, and I'm actually doing that for like an ambient project with a digitone. So you have kind of like infinite sound shaping possibilities, but I'm only using the effects here as part of that territory, and I'm doing effects elsewhere. If I was to start using the Eventide H9, or they now have one that has 2 effect circuits, so you, instead of bringing 2 boxes, I could bring 1 box, I would be doing, I would start some patches here, run them through the H9, try to find some crazy working things, and then just spend a lot more time with the effects, whatever, with the sound sources here being processed by effects as part of the performance. And you could do the same thing with just these, what are they? These effects, which are here in the master. But I'm not doing that. You can, it's a valid way of doing it. I'm just only using them as part of the sound set.
And you mentioned that you printed some of the audio into analog rhythm, right? Like
Yeah.
long textures.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you do that all the time, or just if you're using this type of setup?
So that's a great question. That's very tricky because, like, so I love these like really complex sounds that are evolving, and there's like filters and like I love wavetable synthesis, but you could also modulate any sound source. Like you could modulate the frequency cutoff of audio or whatever. So like I love stuff like this, and so I basically, it's part of my sound or my signature, like kind of what I gravitate towards, to have those sounds. The problem is like those sounds, when you try to bounce them to audio, they never sound the same because like they're so complex and there's so much going on. And sometimes you have to export them like five loops of it, and if it's an endless sound, but then when you hit stop, that sound, the tail of it is like also some infinite thing, and you don't have that here unless you record just the tail, and then when you somehow make sure that when you stop it, the tail comes in, but that's actually really hard. And those sounds are almost impossible to loop because they're so modulated, they don't have a looping point. So you can't actually loop it. And so it can get really difficult. I love doing that, and that's actually my favorite part of sound design, to do that either in Bitwig or in Faceplant. I'm going to continue to do that. I prefer to just have the synth and not bounce that to audio. But in this case, I was like committed to just 2 machines and not too much more. I mean, I guess I could just have, there's these small, the black box samplers. I could just use the laptop just for complex evolving patches, and then I wouldn't have to print them to audio. But yeah, it's very, very tricky. So to answer your question, I do this all the time. It is very hard to figure out what to print to audio because half of them you cannot print to audio, and having a loop point. But if I can manage to constrain myself, then I put them in here. And I love those sounds. It's my favorite part, that you have something like, it's maybe like why I make music, so I could have stuff that's just like doing.
You mentioned the black box sampler, right? Are you using it part of your setup somewhere?
Well, I guess the thing is, like, if you, let's say you have multiple sounds like this at the same time, like you could either have, I have this wavetable synth called the Nanobox Fireball, and that thing has 8 voices, but it's only 1 sequence, so it could do crazy sounds, but at the end of the day, it's 1 patch, right? And if I want to have 3 patches like that, then I would have to have 3 fireballs, and luckily they're tiny, so I could have 3 fireballs. But basically, you have to keep bringing more shit. Like, I could use the laptop to do infinite stuff, but then eventually I'm going to be concerned that there's too much CPU stuff going on there. So what I said about the black box thing is that you could essentially have a more complex sampler, because this is only mono, and you cannot do so much with it. And I also, I only have 1 pad at a time in this set. So if I want to have 2 or 3 pads at a time, I would probably need either not print it to audio, or a more complex sampler that where I have so many more samples, and maybe they even switch where like it like plays, and at the next point it's like another version of the same thing, and it kind of like keeps evolving. But yeah, I mean, the best thing would be to have infinite gear, but then you're like the Chemical Brothers, you know, and like you need somebody else to bring it.
I think that you already answered this question, but maybe I'll ask it in a bit different way. Do you always sequence, like, particularly talking about these 2 machines, do you always sequence them from the machines themselves, or do you sequence them from the MIDI, from the Bitwig?
It depends on the material. So like, if I'm playing like dance like this, like functional set, I do, but if it's ambient, I don't. And the reason is, and we should, by the way, we spent a lot of time, so this is the last question from you, and then I can say a few words about Bitwig quickly, because he wanted to just, maybe I'll answer 1 or 2 questions about Bitwig. Basically, in Bitwig, the ways you could vary the parameters, like for example, chance, like probability, and you could basically have these way more complex ways of shaping the sound if you meticulously, you know, spend time ahead of time to prepare it, and then it makes sense to sequence them from there. You could also, when I was getting certified as a Bitwig trainer, we had these test exercises, and I ended up with a task to make a MIDI device in their modular environment. And I made this basically drum machine sequencer, which was, it didn't have any sounds, it was just like a sequencer. And I made some macros where if you twist them, it starts to do weird things, basically like kind of swing in different ways, or resequence in different ways, because some of them were modulating the length of a sequence. And you could do stuff like that, and I think it totally makes sense for like production at home, and it makes sense for ambient, because in particular for ambient, you could have a really long modulation that's tied to a gate signal, and then you have the gate in the DAW. You have the modulation also tied to the gate that's doing something trippy, and you could be modulating the start point at each gate of the modulation. So you could do all these like crazy things in there, but I wouldn't do that for a dance set, because like basically it's too much in here to like remember what's going on, and you would have to kind of have it perfect and not, you couldn't wrap your head around what's going, like I could wrap my head around everything that's happening here anytime, and if something goes wrong, I could easily just like turn it off or control it. If you're doing something crazy over there, you won't. But so to summarize, I think it makes sense for ambient, it probably makes sense for production, it probably makes sense for some other uses, but I wouldn't do it here, and I don't do it here. And I've tried it, and one of the reasons why I didn't do that for dance is like, and I was doing that with the digitone, because in that set I also had a digitone, and I was sequencing parts of the sounds from the laptop and parts from here, and it can be really confusing which sound is coming from where, because if you're doing that here, you also have like a clip launcher that's moving to the next clip here, and then you're kind of like, you don't know where the sound's coming from. It's hard to remember if it's coming from here or from here, and if you have, let's say, like some second kick that's just like there, and you all of a sudden you can't remember how to turn it off, it can really throw you off. So I decided for dance music to not do that on purpose, but it totally makes sense for other ones. Cool. The person who wanted to know about Bitwig, we don't have much time, but what interests you about that? Maybe I could say a few words. That.
I know about Bitwig. I know that it's DAW, but I don't know how it works. I know how it looks. It looks difficult.
Okay. Can we switch to my screen? Yeah, okay, last few minutes and we close. I'm going to open it. You can keep talking. Like, so...
I also I know about Bitwig, so what I think everyone would be interested in how you set up a live, or what kind of workflow do you use in the Bitwig? Basically, if you're constructing a live, say, ambient or something, like do you do the arrangement, or do you do part as like do you do scenes and switch between scenes, or do you combine the approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to open something that I worked on to show you. So I'll show you something simple. This is, I don't know if this is a great thing to show, but let's try it.
We can put your laptop in the sound to sound it up.
No, it's fine. I'm just going to do a visual. Actually, that's not a great example. Here. I mean, that's probably good, but how would I go from it? Because like, we don't have an input here unless I mean, I could plug in this interface and then we go to the stereo output.
Ah,
I'm prepared. Sorry, this is going to take 1 sec. Do you have like an RCA?
We can take from your laptop 3.5.
Yeah, no, but let's use an interface. Or you don't. I mean,
we need to look.
you need that kind of output.
But you can plug in audio.
You actually have this cable here. It's the
It's here on
record
the-
out. Yeah, you
oh,
could pull it out.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, this one. And just go reverse.
Oh, we have such one. Exercise and jigs.
Oh, but I need. Can you go into this one? No.
We should something put out from Xeon and put in. We can get that one to you.
Okay.
And I will.
Ah, you put it in here. Yeah, yeah, into the input. Yeah, got it. You mean the return?
Yeah.
This is kind of a funny project, but try it. One sec. Make sure I don't blow off the speakers. Is it 2? Okay. Yeah, I think it's just the project. Let me see what I was doing here. No, I think I soloed something. I'll do another project because this one's a little bit funny. Oh, it's very funny actually. Wow, there's so much interference. Do you hear it? Whatever. Okay, cool. It's better example. So, okay, so back to your question. So how do I use Bitwig? I love to use this view, which is the clip view. For those of you who haven't used Bitwig, it looks very similar to Ableton, but there's some key differences. So I love this view because it's more like jamming. But then you have the kind of like the question of what if you want to make a song. So then you could switch to the arrange view. In Bitwig, you could actually have them side by side. So like here, there's essentially, here's the jam state and here's the arrange state, and you can go back and forth, and you could like go back and forth for a given track. So like, if Sorry, I have to restart the timeline to prove the point. Okay, so this is all from the arranger. So I'm just going to explain real quick what's going on here. So I made this jam in the mix view, in the clip view, and then I switched to to the arranger view, and I'm trying to make an arrangement, and this is like more of a it's not a techno track, and also the mixing is all over the place because it's not a finished thing, but like so I basically spend a lot of time I'll let it play at like a lower level. So I spend a lot of time in here, and a lot of these are kind of like complex sounds with a bunch of stuff going on in them. And in this project, I was actually, this is an exercise that I recommend doing. Try taking one sound and make a track out of it. So basically, I started with one sound, and I am doing weird things to this sound. Basically, I'm re-synthesizing that sound to every other sound in this track. And
the whole sound is metal bar tonal 001 off, and then you...
well, actually, that one is also synthesized. Like, it was all one. I forgot what the original sound was, but it was not that. It was, that's also like this thing, like that's also somehow, I think it's a granular thing, and I'm granulating and using a resonator to make it sound like I'm screeching through metal. So the way that I use Bitwig is like I will spend a lot of time in the effects chains, and my favorite thing about Bitwig is their modular environment, which is not visible here, but I'll just open a new track real quick. So here we go. It's called Polygrid, and there's a version that's just MIDI, a version that's just audio, and one that's both. So Polygrid is both. Looks like this. And I'll open somebody else's patch that's more complex. Oops, sorry, wrong button. Okay, so you have these like crazy patches here. Wait, that one's not so this is actually a very simple one. Let me try to find one that's like way crazier. It's a little bit crazier, but not much crazier. Anyway, you have this like modular environment, which is kind of like Max MSP, but it's more user-friendly because, like, I don't know, it's prettier. And the thing that I like about, sorry, I'm gonna like solo this one track here. Okay, so, and just add a, come on, open. Just add a middle C to this patch so we could hear some different. Okay. Okay, so. Okay, so back to the patch. So what I love about Bitwig, and like just to try to summarize what's unique about Bitwig or why you would want to try that versus like sticking to Ableton or whatever else you're using. One of the reasons they have this modular environment that's like, I think, super user-friendly, and you could just build something really easily. Like if you were gonna start from scratch, I'm just gonna stop this one for a second. So let's just say you have another polygrid also with a middle C, and okay, so there's your like super simple sound, but let's just say you want to add another more complex oscillator. So here's a wavetable, and let's say you want that to be something crazier. So you would just, so now you have this sound, and let's say you want to modulate the sound. The second biggest thing about Bitwig is having modulators. So these things here are basically your modulators. And if you want to modulate a signal, you just click on the modulator, like the one I just added. So now I'm like modulating the wavetable index, or like which part of the wavetable is being used. Give it a little bit more sound. So very quickly, like this is, by the way, this is super simple, but let's just say now I want to get fancier, so I'll just like duplicate this one, pick a different type of oscillator, this one. Oh wait, I don't know if that's an oscillator. Swarm, okay. So now I can add a mixer. And instead of now I'm gonna like modulate this with. Okay, so like it's basically this like blank canvas, but with the modulators, which is my second most favorite thing, you could do the craziest stuff, and I just love that you could modulate anything, with any sound to infinitely, and also, stop this for a second. Also, they added in the new version this these project level modulators. So let's just say that I wanted this LFO to be in all of my instruments. I don't know why you would want that, but you might. I could basically put it on the project level and just like apply just a little bit of LFO to like every part of the arrangement, and then the whole thing would kind of like just have one element that keeps changing in the same way. I could also modulate a modulator with a modulator, so maybe I have the same LFO but twice as fast on some of the buses, and now it's this other thing that I made is like derivative of the original modulator, but it's different. And basically you could do that like forever. And you also have, so you have, this modulator is for that device, but you also have modulators for the track and for the project. And you have kind of like, basically it's infinite modulation. And it's kind of a blend between, because if you're just using Max or just using Ableton, of course there's many like Max devices, but like this gives you the kind of the structure of a DAW, and it has like the clock, and if you want it has the range review and print to audio and all this other stuff that you use, but then it has this crazy modular environment, and that modular environment, by the way, can be infinitely modulated in a same, like you could use the same modulation for your audio and for there, and you could also work with audio, like you could add a sampler here. Where is it? It's in oscillators. Yeah, sampler. So let's say you have a, I don't know what this is, but you have a sound, and you could, and by the way here, the sampler, this is another thing I love about Bitwig, is like the sampler is also a wavetable synth and a granular synth. So like these modes here where it says cycles, textures, like repitch is just what you expect from a sampler, by the way, you have this help here, so you kind of like can see what each thing does. And this is live, so basically if I play this sound, which I should, I can see these things move and understand what they are, and I could modulate all of them in this modular environment. So I could like modulate the audio. It's kind of like an octatrack, but like a modular octatrack, just in this one track. In an octatrack, you have 8 tracks, that's what's called an octatrack. Here you have infinite tracks to do this kind of thing with. So basically it's, for sound design, it's like an amazing, amazing tool. I want to show you quickly the sandboxing. Let's see where it was. Okay, see here where it says, this is how to put the, this means that if one thing crashes, everything's going to crash. But here, I could basically start, sorry, this is by plugin. I could say here, these will be individually sandboxed together. Or I could say everything by some manufacturer is going to be sandboxed together because I think their stuff crashes or something. And then you have, basically you have these different ways of how much you're going to sandbox. And then you have, for MIDI, they added this feature in, I think in Bitwig 4. Oops. Okay, here. So here on the left, you have these operators, which will basically modulate like different aspects of the sound. Sorry, I have to click on a note. Here, operators. So you could do things like, I want this note to only play 50% of the time. And this is like how it spread the probabilities. Then I could say I only want it to play if it's the first note in that clip, or if it's after another clip. And I could say I want it to play every second, third, and no, like this is better. Like it's only the first, the third, and the 6th time. So there's all these like kind of things that you could do with just the MIDI, and you could also build your own MIDI devices, because there's another device here that was just like this one, but it's for MIDI only. It's called Node Grid. Sorry. And just delete this for a sec. Oh, I'm in the presets. Yeah, okay, so this device. So that's the same thing, but it's for MIDI. And here I could do all these like math operations and like play with it. And also in Bitwig, time is phase, which means that time is just going from 0 to 1 all the time. That's like a loop. And you could modulate time, because if you just basically modulate the curve, instead of time going linear, instead of time going from 0 to 1 in a linear way, you could make it that time is slower in the beginning and then faster in the end, which kind of can really mess with the rhythm and the swing. So yeah, basically to summarize about Bitwig, infinite sound design possibilities through modulation, their modular environment, and things you could do with just notes. And you could, because of this modular environment, a lot of people recreate entire synths with like, you know, your favorite synth, like somebody's probably remade that. If you don't want to buy the synth because you want to try it out without buying it, like you could try it out here. And there's, for the most popular synths, there's they're already recreated, or you could try to recreate your own. It runs pretty light. It doesn't like, it's crashed on me a few times, but like, I don't think it crashes as much as Ableton. Although I have no data to prove that. I've just heard from, because I don't use Ableton, so I can't compare, but this doesn't crash that much, and I've heard that Ableton crashes a lot. Yeah, those are probably its strongest things. Oh, and yeah, having this mixed view between jam and arrange, and yeah, there's more to it, but that's my favorite stuff. Yeah, originally I just wanted to talk about Bitwig, and I would have prepared an entire talk just about that, but because 9 out of 10 people wanted to from about hardware, hear about hardware, maybe some other time I do just Bitwig session or just something else, but yeah. I think we went way over time. We were supposed to do 90 minutes, but this is 2 hours already. I guess I spoke for 50% longer than I thought I would. So yeah, thank you so much for coming.